Our agenda, and now I'd like to invite representatives of Amnesty International. They will announce the annual review for Amnesty International 2014-2015, human rights issues in Ukraine and in the world.
Kryvosheyev, заступник директора програми Amnesty International.
And the presentation will be done by Denis Kryvosheyev, Deputy Director of Amnesty International for Europe and Central Asia, Tetiana Mazur, Director of Amnesty International Ukraine, and Krasimir Yankov, Researcher for Amnesty International Ukraine.
Колеги, поки спікери ще не вийшли.
The speakers are about to come. Thank you for coming for this press conference. We'll introduce our report for 2014-2015. And there are 160 countries of the world represented, including Ukraine. Our report proves that 2014 has been very difficult for those people who became the hostages of our conflict and conflicts around the world. So in focus of this annual presentation, there will be conflicts and conflicts of new form, including the conflict in Ukraine. We have stated that there is increase of influence of unlawful military groups all over the world that threaten people and announce quasi-government, new quasi-government, and that shows the necessity for fundamental change in reaction of international community. So one of our new invitations is to stop the veto power of some members of Security Council of UN. But over the last year, we can see the changes. The Central African Republic received peacekeeping contingents, signing Roman statutes by Palestine, and the treaty against the trade of weapons that Amnesty has been promoting. 62 countries have ratified this agreement, and there is potential to the fact that proliferation of weapons in the countries that abuse human rights, this proliferation will be limited. Let me introduce our speakers today. First, we'll have Denis Kryvosheyev, our Deputy Director of Regional Program in Europe, and then you'll see in your folders some additional materials, the press release and reports. We still have infographics and documents about human rights in 2014, the review, regional review in Ukrainian, and Ukrainian part in Ukrainian, Russian part in Russian. We have some video materials available. You'll be able to download them according to the links that you have in your folders. So we'll give presentation video, then have our speakers speak. Okay, thank you.
Government leaders have justified horrific human rights violations by talking of the need to keep the world safe. But we know that knee-jerk reactions and draconian anti-terror laws do not work.
Amnesty International is accusing the Nigerian military of killing more than 600 released prisoners.
We did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
كان حاكم الحكم الاولاني كان 529 تم تعديله الى 37 اعدام والباقي مؤبد.
The shocking indifference and complacency demonstrated by governments and key international bodies. They chose to look the other way.
We want world leaders to confront the changing face of conflict. We want a real commitment and complete change in tactics. In the future, this year may come to be known as a year of historic failure for progress in human rights.
Permanent members of the Security Council must renounce their veto powers in situation of mass atrocities, which would enable the United Nations to take real action to protect civilians.
C'est parce que les événements récents, en particulier en Syrie, ont montré que le Conseil de sécurité, lorsqu'il ne peut pas agir, n'assume pas ses responsabilités et que les conséquences sont terribles pour les populations civiles. Nous comptons beaucoup sur le soutien d'Amnesty International pour continuer notre action de plaidoyer et nous allons ensemble développer des actions de manière à convaincre le plus de monde possible dans les opinions publiques et dans les fondations, les institutions, auprès des gouvernements, de la justesse de cette idée.
Amnesty International has warned the EU's immigration policy is turning the continent into Fortress Europe and putting lives at risk.
Instead of paying lip service to the plight of refugees, governments must commit both political and financial resources to assist and protect those displaced.
I've been a relief worker and a human rights worker for more than 30 years. I have never seen as many people fleeing from conflict, from human rights abuse, from war as now. I support this call on governments to receive refugees and to provide protection to those who need it the most, people who flee from violence.
Amnesty International now claims to have concrete proof of direct Russian military involvement in the conflict.
Another crucial step would be to join and implement the Arms Trade Treaty and to further restrict the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect in populated areas. That alone can save thousands of lives.
Закончила рабочий день и пошла за помощью. И в этот период произошел выстрел.
It is equally important to confront the shrinking space for civil society and continued attacks on freedom of expression both on and offline. We will make sure that nobody can say, I did not know. We will stand with victims, their families, activists, to demand justice.
Amnesty International believes that even at times like this, that may seem bleak, it is possible to create change. Change for a safer world without compromising our fundamental rights and freedoms.
Good morning, dear friends. Thank you for coming to our press conference. Thanks for your interest in our report, annual report. One more time, we introduce the overview with human rights for the previous year. This is an opportunity to assess previous events in 160 countries in different regions and in the world in general, to attract attention to awareness analysis to the most important trends and to offer our views about the development with human rights and to offer our vision how to solve problems. And we have to state once again that from the point of view of human rights protection and compliance with them, despite some positive achievements in many countries, the situation has not improved and it's not more secure and more fair. One of the topic, when you look at the central topic and the consequences for civilians and in general compliance with civil rights, human rights, and it's a tragedy that conflict came to Europe and that Ukraine has to face results of the conflict. It's a pity that I cannot speak Ukrainian, and Ukraine, the country where they speak in different languages, and our report is today is in many languages. I will switch to Russian language, which is more convenient for me, and I will be happy to hear your questions in Ukrainian or Russian or English if it is more convenient for you. So the topic of the conflict is central for our report, and in many parts and in the world, we underline violations by states and armed groups, and because of the conflict, those violations became more often, and there came lots of big bad results, and millions of refugees, a million of IDPs that drop in the sea, in the ocean of people who left their house, everything that they had in their life, and to seek for protection, seek for shelter in other countries. Very often they don't have access to the shelter. Armed groups are more noticeably violators, abusers of human rights, and on a broader scale. They use rude methods and how to violate human rights, and they use new methods for their work, so-called social networks for popularization of their activities to get new members, and as a response to military groups and to those problems in the field of security, the states take measures, and very often those measures bring to violation of existing rights and freedoms, and in the field of right of self-expression and other areas, and because they create the ground and atmosphere in which ideas of extreme discrimination flourish, and they cause new conflicts. A little bit more about our region, and the situation is sad. We see that abuse of human rights on main freedoms in many countries, especially in Ukraine. We see what's happening also in Russia. They abuse main rights and all this servitors, and the law on foreign agents. That measure Russian authorities actively use to press other opinion, to take the right for assemblies, and that's against civic groups. And they passed it 2 years ago. Last year they simplified it to simplify the procedure of imposing the attack of foreign agents. And on law advocacy groups and environmental groups and other independent NGOs. And I'm happy to give you more details about that. Also in Russia, we notice the situation with the right for freedom of assemblies, and to come with a peaceful protest, it's more difficult in Russia. And here there is an issue of Ukraine, because we observed so-called an outburst of activity of civic protest during events on Maidan in Crimea and events in Donbass. Activists who came with protests against the war, against occupation and annexation of Crimea, especially they attracted authorities, and they were actively punished by fines and administrative arrest for several days. And now we speak about the first 3 criminal cases against peaceful protesters. Last year, they passed the law. There's a criminal responsibility for violation of the law on assemblies, and after the third one, the authorities have the right to bring to criminal responsibility, and the law is, by its spirit, and is a violation of right for assemblies. So at present, that punishment can be criminal, and 3 cases. There are 3 cases. One of them is not investigated, but 2 are arrested, and that's a big concern. Also, the freedom of speech. Mass media is persecuted, especially if there is independent coverage of Maidan events of Ukraine, and the position which is not agreed with the official assent to the conflict in Donbass. And the media which allowed such freedom, they were under pressure. Not always clear. Sometimes they used administrative tools, and nevertheless, the freedom of speech suffered dramatically. Unfortunately, many of those measures and initiatives in Russia, they if not copied, they are studied in neighboring countries. And in those countries, there are lots of problems. Azerbaijan, unprecedented pressure on different thinking in that country. Leading advocacy groups, journalists, civic activists, and politicians are in prison, in the custody, and they make up the grounds for that. About 20 people are prisoners of conscience in Azerbaijan, and maybe the number of them is quite bigger. The same violations of human rights in the field of freedom of speech and assemblies, we association observe in Belarus and in Central Asia countries and other countries of the region. And we have to return to the topic of tortures and these painful issues all over the world, and how the states responded to armed groups and in other contexts. And there is still an issue of tortures in Ukraine. My colleagues will speak about that later, but let's speak about the conflict in Ukraine, events in Donbass. You know quite well about them. And we, from our point of view, we raised that issue many times, and especially that both parties in the conflict they abuse the laws of war, and they use living quarters as fire points, and they cause the answer to those points, and that leads to victims among civilians. Once again, we observe such things from both parties. Both of them use artillery, including rockets and mortars, and when it's very difficult to separate military targets from civilian targets, and the difference and how to prevent victims among civilians, and the number of civilian casualties is grown. We ask to investigate such cases because sometimes maybe they are those are military crimes, but the military crimes in those under those circumstances that we observed, like kidnapping of people, tortures, and missing, and punishment outside of a court. It's not an excuse that illegal methods are used by the other party. And we are sad that we don't see active steps of Ukraine as the investigation of such evidence, when especially if that was done by those forces that are under control of Kiev, and efforts to bring the responsible to court. The conflict on the other side, it influenced, unfortunately, in Ukraine on the right of self-expression. First of all, time in 5 years, we found Ruslan Katsaba. He's a prisoner of conscience. He stood against mobilization, and he called the conflict as radical, and court decisions according to which he is in custody, they refer to that main evidence of his that he violated the law. You can disagree with his position, but the position, not just a criminal case, could be an answer to the position coming to our journalists. Other answers to those challenges that the world was facing last year. Yes, we believe that there are several measures, and it's international community should not ignore these problems. We call 5G members of the Defense Security Council to refuse the right of veto when they consider the situation with massive violation of human rights. We saw many times cases that Syria, Palestine, Israel, Ukraine, when it was possible to take efficient measures by the Security Council, but they didn't do it because some countries used the right of veto, or they threatened to use, and there was no discussion because of that. That's also we should stop the flow of trafficking of weapons to areas of conflict. One positive achievement yesterday was there was an international trade, military or weapons trade instrument, and we spoke to many colleagues about that, and we spoke about in 20 years it became a reality, and it's important that all the countries, in addition to the main sellers, vendors of weaponry, to follow it, and we need to provide defense and resources for people who are IDPs, refugees because of conflicts, and unfortunately the reaction of countries is they refuse to provide them assistance, and they close their borders. Two examples: Syria, 4 million of people left the country. 95% of them are in countries, neighboring countries, and not the countries with enough of resources. And those who are richer, they would trade to close their borders, trying to break through closed borders. People who have to look for security, and they use extreme measures. They're trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea, or not on rebel boats, and many died in the Mediterranean Sea among the refugees last year. And the programs that existed to save them, and many also in Ukraine, in Italy, it was closed. We need to fight against discrimination and inequality. The topic is quite known for you, and its importance in Ukraine is not from point of view of language, but let's not forget the issue of sexual minority. We have to return to it. Those people, like the rest of minorities, they need to get legal support and equal rights, and the Ukraine, without that, Ukraine has no road to Europe. Also, countries should refuse counterproductive measures, laws that bring to abuse of rights and freedoms. And we observe that in many countries, and even during recent times, and with active discussion of such measures in Europe, especially as a result of sad events against Charlie Hebdo magazine in France. And the last, impunity. All international community should fight against that, and every state should take its responsibility to its commitments. And Ukraine, it's an important issue. And impunity for tortures and other violations by police, and also active in international criminal court. There were two decisions in the parliament. How they worded, we need to move to the jurisdiction of international court to cover events in Ukraine, but not in a kind of selective measures and selective justice. The decision is very simple. Ukraine must ratify Rome Statute, and to take a decision, the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court should cover all the period since the beginning of that body. Otherwise, without such measures, and consequences will be even sadder. Will there be a threat to our rights and freedoms? Fragile agreements about ceasefire in Donbass. We see, and that it is not followed, and the result it is not secretive, that the risk that is not is high that it will not be followed, and if that happens, there will be victims among civilians, and there will be violations of the international humanitarian law, and the reaction of authorities in different countries. And I mentioned the big neighbor of Ukraine to such a situation, and for example, difficulties, economic difficulties Russia is facing, and Western sanctions, they lead that authorities of that country are more aggressive to other thinking in other views in the country. If that continues like that, we will see there will be more violation of human rights. They will press on activists and activists in the field of human rights, and the risk that the same measures will be approved and taken by neighboring countries. We should stop that. And we see what application of limiting laws in the field of human rights leads to, and we have to return to Ukrainian issue in Crimea, where they use Russian laws, and the application brought to violation of rights for assemblies, for ward and associations, and my colleague Krasimir Yankov will speak about that in more details.
Good afternoon. During field mission in Simferopol and Bakhchisarai this year, we see that practice of Russian Federation is applied in annexed Crimea against Crimean and Tatar population. Let me give you two examples. ATR channel, that is the only Crimean Tatar language channel in the world, has been persecuted by the new government, and annexation and occupation are not used through self-censorship. DNR and LNR are not called separatists. This is decision by the channel to continue talk about the events in Crimea. So the government accreditation of one journalist was stopped after he refused to stand up during Russian Federation anthem played at the new parliament of Crimea. 26th of January 2015, ATR channel office was searched. About 30 people came at 11 in the morning, and they came to the office of the channel. They were representing the extremism combating center, and they were referring to the case of mass meeting by Crimean parliament, and during that meeting 2 people were killed, and the circumstances of their deaths were not investigated. So at the end of January this year, Akhtem Chigos, Crimean Tatar, was detained. He is the acting leader of Crimean Tatars, and Natalia Poklonska, the main prosecutor of Crimea, and she announced that he is suspected to be the leader of mass protests in Crimea. And we witnessed the continued arrest of Chigos. The lawyer of Chigos and his relatives were called. That court session was gathered for hours after the call. That is not sufficient time to prepare defense of the accused. Despite the open character of this session in Kiev court of Simferopol about 5:45, the announcement was there is no place for her because the courtroom was full in 15 minutes. The explanation was changed that the building of the court is closed after 6 and nobody is allowed. Then the question why the session of the court is scheduled for 6 if you cannot enter the building, but we did not receive the answer about Euromaidan. Unfortunately, investigation of Euromaidan cases shows that there is lack of knowledge, skills, and there is abuse of justice. So many people who have suffered from abuse of police were not defended. Let me remind that according to Ministry of Healthcare of Ukraine, 105 people were killed, including 13 members of police force. First person killed was Sergei Nikolai on 22nd of January 2014. He received 4 shots, including neck and head. His killer was not found yet. Other protesters were tortured and hurt. Irina Repchenyuk, 51 years old, who was watching the protest, was hit with baton, and her skull was cracked, and she lost eyesight in one eye. After the medical treatment, She still did not receive the results of expertise, and she cannot receive any compensation for her suffering. Another episode on Gruszewska Street on 20th January 2014. Vasilevsky, 21 years old, was tortured. His tear gas was applied to him. He did not receive any reaction from investigators, while they told us that they received a certain claim. The new Ukrainian government that came after February promised to investigate the infringement of human rights and to punish the guilty parties. But the lack of investigation of these precedents gives risk to continue lack of punishment for abuse by police. Tetiana, Mazur, please. Good afternoon. I'd like to say that Euromaidan and events in the East have only shown the problems that Ukraine had for years, and problems that Amnesty International has announced in many of its reports, including the reports we are presenting today. The abuse by police, lack of punishment, neglect to human rights, and the supremacy of the law remain the problems of Ukraine, chronic problems of Ukraine, while epicenter of human rights is in the east of the country, but the solution of the problem is possible in Kyiv. Ukrainian government must apply measures to effectively fight abuse of human rights and to make it impossible to have such tragic events in the future. We call again for Ukrainian government to reform law enforcement. We call for the government to begin immediately the process of creating State Bureau for Investigations. In this way, this agency would be effective and operative in responding to all claims against abuse by police, so Ukrainian law enforcement would be responsible and people would restore their trust in police. We understand that creating a new agency is not panacea. It's important that those who create this State Bureau for Investigations would consider mistakes and shortcomings of existing system to avoid them. But what's most important, the State Bureau of Investigation should be created based on principles defined by the Council of Europe, European Court on Human Rights, in many decisions against Ukraine that relate to lack of efficiency of investigating claims against law enforcement. Such agency must be independent, should be controlled by civil society, and it should have all resources that would be worthy of the task. As we look at the events of Euromaidan, at all infringement of human rights that have happened during last winter, and as we look at the conflict in the East, we see that they are united by lack of punishment for very serious human rights infringements. It's important to investigate every announcement of infringement of international human rights. Every kidnapping, every torture should be investigated, but in this context it's important for Ukraine to join International Criminal Court, so the government of Ukraine would fulfill its obligation, in the area of human rights through ratification of Roman Statute. At this time, we don't see reasons for delaying this process. We know to ratify Roman Statute, the Constitution of Ukraine must be changed. This process is lengthy, difficult, but possible. This time, in the Parliament of Ukraine, the draft law is registered with necessary changes to constitution to ratify Roma Statute. But what's necessary is political will from the members of parliament to include it into agenda and to vote for it. And we believe that such way will be decisive step on the way to fight lack of punishment. That would be strict signal from government of Ukraine. The gravest punishment for the war crimes would happen, and there is no place for such war crimes in Ukraine. Thank you for the presentation. Now your questions, please, to all three speakers.
Дякую, Тетяна.
Thank you very much, Tetiana. Please don't forget to introduce yourself and name whom you ask the question. No questions? I don't know. To whom address this question? Ukraine. You published an piece of information that Viktor Yanukovych could, during a year, return all his profits. I would like to hear how. What delayment of it's because of the delay of investigation? Could you tell us from where you get such information? That was not our report. Maybe that was a Transparency International, because corruption is not our field. We work on human rights and freedoms. When we speak about events last winter, about the Euromaidan, we speak about violation of human rights during Euromaidan and abscess and that there is no investigation of that element. When we speak about violation of human rights, we mean unproportional use of force by police against peaceful protesters, torture, indecent treatment of and killing the 700. Those are the issues we are working on. When we speak about that sector of those violations of human rights, when we speak about investigation, we mean that those who gave orders and those who executed those orders, police, Berkut, they should be all of them should be responsible, because now they blame the former leadership of the country, and they forget that Berkut was using that force, and they're here. They're still within the Ministry of Interior, and they should be. That's the most important issue for us in the field of Euromaidan. More questions? Radio Liberty. There was I thought that sanctions against Russia worsen the situation in that country. What do you mean? What's your suggestion? To cancel sanction for that not to take place? No. We don't have a position on sanctions as such, because the states, different countries take those measures, and it's not the field which is our competence. We say that in our forecasts that probably will observe what we'll observe in the future, and we don't expect. It's difficult to expect that the economic situation of Russia will improve, and that events in Crimea and in the east the sanctions will be cancelled, but the response to events in Ukraine and the freedom of coverage and on protest in Ukraine, the resurrection in Russia is always tough, and probably will have to observe that again and again. Thank you. If there is no more questions, then I have a question. As you know, police reform has begun. Do you see any progress, or do you cooperate with reforms in that field to encourage a better investigation? The reform of criminal justice and police is something we were working on before Euromaidan, and we continue working on that now. And we monitor all the processes of reforms. But I would like to say that our main recommendation is to set up instruments of control police. So special body that would be efficient investigating all the complaints against police. So if, for example, The idea is, if such ideas will be implemented, there will be less violations, and there will be less of them, and they will have a get so anyway, there should be a restraint mechanism. It doesn't matter how well they are provided, and they should know that if they violate human rights, rights of citizens, that irreversibly they will have to stand in court. And that's why we speak about the State Bureau of Investigation, because according to the logic of criminal procedures code passed in 2012, such a body will investigate all the complaints against illegal activity of police. And we know that there was the draft law on State Bureau investigation brought into the parliament. It has happened several days ago, and we'll analyze that document, and we'll work on with MPs for that body, not just to be created, but for that body to be efficient and to be it should be built on the principles of the Council of Europe and on case law of European Court on Human Rights. It's impossible to speak about the reform of police from the reform and all the rest. No investigation of crimes on Maidan shows that the police is not able to handle that system, and prosecution also, and that's why to speak to have separate reform police without the reform and the rest of the system, it's impossible. That body will not be able to reform itself from inside, so it's important to develop those mechanisms. My colleague told. Violations, there are violations in all the system, but there should be tools that will fight against those violations. And now we then have them. We hope that they will be created. We will keep an eye on the law. We will monitor State Investigation Bureau, and now there are a lot of questions to that process, because the document should be well thought. It should be connected to many other issues, to the broader reform, and it should be include a mechanism of independence and of public control. And in the last draft law, we don't see those things. Clear. One more question. I have a question about veto right, or refusal from veto right in the UN Security Council. What is the mechanism of to refuse veto right, and what are you focused about that? Mechanism is very simple. We call the countries that have that right and not to use it under complete conditions when there is an issue of measures against massive violation of human rights. For example, when peacekeepers could help, and one of 5G is against it, they should refuse such a right. And there are some similar situations, like prospects in the hands of 5G. They must take such an obligation, such commitment, and they should act according to it. Now, it's more realistic to speak about that than earlier, because there was different suggestions. All of this that the UN Security Council is not efficient in front of challenges in the world. One our suggestion is one of others, and because there is a better understanding of this problem, and there is a need to take new steps in this, and I believe that the chance is higher now. Thank you very much. We're done with this press briefing, and looking forward for new reports and new updates